He pressed the cold steel of his revolver against the polished mahogany, his dark eyes promising absolute ruin. "Give me one reason why I shouldn't have you buried beneath the rose garden right now," he growled, expecting the usual reaction, the trembling, the tears, the desperate begging for mercy. Instead, the curvy, plus-size maid simply adjusted the straps of her apron, looked him dead in the eye, and sighed. "Because, Mr. Costa, blood is notoriously hard to get out of antique Persian rugs, and frankly, tomorrow is my day off." The iron gates of the Costa estate loomed like the entrance to purgatory, intricate and imposing against the grey, overcast New York sky. Juliet Jenkins sat in the back of the town car, her hands resting calmly on her lap. She smoothed the fabric of her simple black skirt over her thick thighs, taking a slow, measured breath. She was 28, possessing a figure that was undeniably full, soft, and generous. In a world that often demanded women shrink themselves, Juliet had long ago made peace with the space she occupied. She was fat, she was healthy, and she was fiercely practical. There was no room in her life for insecurities, not when her younger brother Toby was lying in a hospital bed with a failing liver and a medical bill that looked like a telephone number. That was the sole reason she was passing through these terrifying gates. The Costa family was synonymous with organized crime on the East Coast. Everyone in the city knew that the shipping empire they ran was merely a front for blood, guns, and shadows. But Juliet also knew that working as the head maid for Enzo Costa paid exactly 4 times the standard market rate, with an upfront signing bonus that would cover Toby's place on the transplant list. The car glided to a halt in front of a sprawling stone mansion. Juliet stepped out, her practical, non-slip shoes crunching against the gravel. She grabbed her duffel bag, her broad shoulders squared, and walked up the imposing marble steps. She was greeted at the heavy oak doors by Gregory, a thin, balding man in a pristine suit whose eyes darted nervously around the property. He was the estate manager, and he looked entirely out of his depth. "Miss Jenkins," Gregory said, his voice clipped. He looked her up and down, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. Perhaps he had expected someone smaller, someone meeker. "I'll be blunt. You are the 4th maid we have hired this month. The last 3 left in tears, and 1 left without even packing her bags." "I don't cry easily, Gregory," Juliet replied, her voice smooth and rich, like dark honey. "And I don't run from a mess. Show me my quarters and tell me what the man likes for breakfast." Gregory sighed, a sound of profound exhaustion. "Mr. Costa is particular. He demands absolute silence when he is in his study. You are not to make eye contact with his associates. If you see something, you did not see it. If you hear something, you did not hear it. You are to be a ghost, Miss Jenkins, a very efficient, invisible ghost." "I can be invisible," Juliet said, though her physical presence made the statement somewhat ironic. She was a woman who anchored a room just by standing in it, radiating a quiet, immovable warmth. Over the next 2 days, Juliet proved herself to be exactly what she promised. The mansion was a beautiful nightmare. Men in tailored suits, with suspicious bulges under their arms, constantly moved through the halls. The air always smelled faintly of expensive cigar smoke, espresso, and occasionally the metallic tang of copper. Juliet worked tirelessly. She scrubbed the imported marble floors until they gleamed. She ironed Enzo Costa's custom shirts with a precision that bordered on surgical. She did not flinch when she found a blood-stained silk tie discarded on the bathroom floor. She simply pre-treated it with hydrogen peroxide, cold water, and a dash of baking soda, washing the violence away in the sink without a second thought. Poverty and the threat of losing her only living relative had thoroughly burned the fear out of her. The Mafia was terrifying, yes, but the American healthcare system was a far more ruthless monster. She caught glimpses of him, of course. Enzo Costa. He was 34, tall, and built like a middleweight boxer beneath his $1,000 suits. He had a jawline carved from granite and eyes the color of a stormy sea. I was beautiful in the way a hurricane is beautiful, fascinating to look at, but inherently destructive. He ignored her completely, treating her as just another piece of the furniture, which suited Juliet just fine. Until the third night. Juliet had stayed up late. The house was supposed to be empty, as Enzo and his inner circle were out conducting business. She was in the grand library, a room strictly off-limits during the day. But the mahogany desk had accumulated a layer of dust that was bothering her professional pride, and she had decided to tackle it while the boss was away. She was humming quietly to herself, a soft blues melody, swaying her hips slightly as she polished the wood, the scent of lemon oil filling the air. She was in her zone, completely unaware of the heavy front door opening, or the heavy, angry footsteps echoing down the hall. The library doors burst open with a violent crash. Juliet jumped, the polishing cloth freezing in her hand. Enzo Costa stood in the doorway. He looked like a man who had just walked through hell. His tie was ripped off, his suit jacket was missing, and the white sleeves of his shirt were rolled up, revealing heavily tattooed forearms. More alarmingly, his knuckles were bruised and split, dripping crimson onto the floor, and a thin line of blood trickled from a fresh cut on his cheekbone. I was breathing heavily, his chest heaving, his eyes wild and dark with leftover adrenaline and rage. When his gaze snapped to Juliet, the temperature in the room plummeted. He didn't see a maid. In his paranoid, adrenaline-fueled state, he saw an intruder in his most private sanctuary, hovering over the desk where he kept his ledgers. "What the hell are you doing?" Enzo's voice was a low, lethal rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. Juliet slowly lowered the cloth. She didn't scream. She didn't cower. She looked at the blood dripping onto the priceless carpet and felt a brief twinge of annoyance. "I'm polishing the mahogany, sir. It was getting dull." Enzo stepped into the room, kicking the heavy doors shut behind him with a deafening slam. The silence that followed the slamming of the doors was suffocating. Enzo stalked toward her, with the predatory grace of a cornered panther. As he closed the distance, the sheer size of the man became overwhelmingly apparent. He towered over Juliet, casting a long, dark shadow that engulfed her. He stopped mere inches away. Juliet had to tilt her head back to look at him. She could smell the sharp tang of gunpowder, mixed with expensive cologne and sweat. In a flash of movement, Enzo's hand darted out. He didn't strike her, but his large, bloodied fingers slammed onto the desk, trapping her between his arm and the heavy wood. His other hand reached into the waistband of his trousers, drawing a sleek black revolver and pressing the cold barrel directly against the wood, inches from her hand. "You think I'm a fool?" Enzo hissed, his breath washing over her face. "You think because you waltz around here, taking up space, playing the innocent, heavy-set maid, that I wouldn't notice you snooping? Who sent you? Was it the Lombardi family? Did they think I wouldn't suspect the woman who blends into the background? I was trying to break her. Juliet recognized the tactic. Men like Enzo Costa thrived on the power they held over others. They fed on fear. They expected the women in their orbit to be small, fragile, and easily intimidated. He looked at her curves, at her softness, and expected her to crumble under the weight of his aggression. But Juliet Jenkins was built of sturdier stuff. She looked at the gun. Then she looked at the blood steadily dripping from his knuckles onto the desk she had just spent 20 minutes polishing. She let out a long, weary sigh. "Give me one reason why I shouldn't have you buried beneath the rose garden right now," Enzo growled, his finger hovering near the trigger, waiting for the inevitable breakdown. Juliet calmly reached into her apron pocket. Enzo's eyes flared, his grip on the gun tightening, but he paused when she pulled out nothing more than a pristine white handkerchief. "Because, Mr. Costa," Juliet said, her voice completely steady, devoid of even a tremor. "Blood is notoriously hard to get out of antique Persian rugs. The rose garden is lovely, but frankly, tomorrow is my day off, and I have no desire to spend my Friday morning scrubbing biological stains out of wool fibers." Enzo froze. The absolute absurdity of her statement hung in the air. He blinked, the red haze of his rage faltering for a fraction of a second. He stared at her, genuinely taken aback. There was no shaking in her hands. Her large, warm brown eyes met his cold ones with an expression that wasn't defiance, but rather profound exhaustion. Before he could process his confusion, Juliet did the unthinkable. She reached forward, gently but firmly grasped his thick wrist, and pushed the hand holding the gun away from the desk. "Furthermore," Juliet continued, stepping slightly to the side to break his imposing trap, "you are ruining the finish on this desk. Sit down." "Excuse me?" Enzo whispered, the words escaping him before he could stop them. No one gave him orders. No one. "I said sit down," Juliet repeated, pointing to a heavy leather armchair. "You're bleeding all over the floor, and if it sets, I'll have to use the heavy chemicals, which will give Gregory a migraine." "Sit." For a moment, Enzo's pride warred with his shock. He could shoot her. He should shoot her. But the complete lack of fear in her demeanor had completely derailed his violent momentum. Like a man sleepwalking, he lowered the weapon, slid it back into his holster, and slowly sank into the leather armchair. Juliet immediately went to work. She moved with surprising grace for a woman of her size to the small ensuite bathroom attached to the library. She returned a moment later with a basin of warm water, a bottle of antiseptic, and fresh towels. She pulled up a small wooden stool and sat in front of him. "Give me your hands," she demanded softly. Enzo, still in a state of bewildered paralysis, extended his bruised, bloody hands. Juliet took them in hers. Her hands were soft, plump, and incredibly warm. It was a stark contrast to the cold, harsh world Enzo inhabited. She didn't ask who he had beaten or why he was bleeding. She simply dipped a cloth into the warm water and began to meticulously clean his knuckles. "You're not afraid of me," Enzo stated. It wasn't a question. It was an observation, spoken with a mixture of suspicion and a strange, bubbling fascination. "I am terrified of many things, Mr. Costa," Juliet replied, dabbing antiseptic onto a particularly nasty cut on his middle knuckle. Enzo hissed at the sting, but her grip held firm. "I am terrified of failing my brother. I am terrified of hospital bills, I am terrified of running out of time. You? She looked up, her gaze pinning him to the chair. You're just a man who makes messes, and I'm the woman paid to clean them up. Now hold still, or this is going to scar poorly. She finished wrapping his knuckles in clean, white gauze. Then, without hesitation, she reached up with a damp cloth and gently wiped the dried blood from the cut on his cheek. For a fleeting second, her soft fingers brushed against his jaw. Enzo's breath hitched. A jolt of electricity shot through him, completely unrelated to the sting of the antiseptic. He looked at her face, truly looked at her for the first time. She had a round, beautiful face, with a dusting of freckles across her nose and lips that were naturally pink and full. She didn't look like the supermodels and starlets he usually entertained, women who were sharp angles and hollow smiles. Juliet was soft, grounding, and real. There, Juliet said, standing up and smoothing her apron over her wide hips. She picked up the basin. I will bring you a glass of bourbon. Drink it, go to sleep, and try not to bleed on the sheets. Good night, Mr. Costa. She turned and walked out of the library, the quiet click of the door shutting behind her, echoing in the vast room. Enzo Costa sat in the dimly lit library for a long time, staring at his neatly bandaged hands. His heart was beating unusually fast, and it had nothing to do with the violence of the night. It had everything to do with the plus-size maid who had just looked the devil in the eye and scolded him for making a mess. The dynamic in the Costa mansion shifted irreparably after that night. To the rest of the staff, and to Enzo's inner circle of enforcers, nothing seemed different. Juliet remained the quiet, efficient, heavy-set maid who kept the estate running like a well-oiled machine. But between Enzo and Juliet, an invisible electric thread had been pulled taut. Enzo found himself becoming hyper-aware of her presence. He, a man whose mind was constantly occupied by multi-million-dollar deals, territory wars, and avoiding federal indictments, was suddenly distracted by the way Juliet's thick thighs strained against the fabric of her skirt when she bent to pick up a dropped napkin. He noticed the way she hummed when she thought she was alone. He noticed that she moved with a heavy, rhythmic grace that he found entirely hypnotic. He tested her, of course. His paranoia wouldn't let him just accept this anomaly. He left a loaded Sig Sauer pistol sitting casually on the kitchen island, where she was preparing his morning espresso. He sat at the dining table, pretending to read the newspaper, waiting to see if she would panic, call the police, or perhaps try to use it. Juliet walked into the kitchen, saw the gun, rolled her eyes, expertly ejected the magazine, cleared the chamber, and placed the weapon and the bullets into a Tupperware container, which she shoved to the back of the pantry. When she brought him his coffee, she placed it down with a heavy thud. Guns near the stove are a safety hazard, sir. The heat can affect the primer. If you want to shoot your own appliances, do it on your own time. Drink your coffee. Enzo had to hide his smirk behind the rim of the porcelain cup. She was magnificent. She was an absolute fortress of a woman. But the true test of her mettle, and the moment Enzo realized his fascination had evolved into something dangerously close to obsession, occurred 2 weeks later during a high-stakes dinner party. Enzo was hosting a peace summit with the Lombardi family, a rival faction from New Jersey. The tension in the grand dining room was thick enough to choke on. 10 dangerous men sat around the long mahogany table, picking at their roasted lamb, while trading veiled threats and posturing for dominance. Leo Lombardi, the head of the rival family, was a vitos. bloated man who compensated for his insecurities with cruelty. He had been needling Enzo all night, trying to provoke a reaction. Juliet was acting as the head server, moving quietly around the table, pouring expensive Barolo wine into crystal glasses. Leo watched Juliet as she approached his side of the table. His eyes dragged over her full figure, his lip curling into a sneer of pure malice. He waited until the dining room was momentarily silent before speaking, his voice booming over the table. "Tell me, Enzo," Leo drawled, swirling the wine in his glass. "Business must be booming if you're feeding your staff this well. Or did you hire a livestock handler by mistake?" "Careful, Costa. She looks like she'll eat your profits before the feds can seize them." The room went dead silent. Enzo's enforcers, standing by the doors, instantly tensed, their hands subtly drifting toward their jackets. Enzo's eyes turned entirely black. A cold, murderous fury erupted in his chest. He placed his fork down with a slow, deliberate motion. He was going to kill Leo Lombardi. He didn't care about the peace treaty. He was going to carve the man's tongue out. But before Enzo could open his mouth to issue a death sentence, Juliet stepped forward. She didn't blush. She didn't shrink away or run from the room in tears. She stood tall, holding the heavy silver wine decanter with perfect poise. She looked down at Leo Lombardi with an expression of mild, polite pity. She leaned in slightly, just enough to invade his personal space, and proceeded to pour the red wine into his glass. She poured it perfectly, but she didn't stop. The dark red liquid rose to the rim, crested, and spilled over, splashing directly onto Leo's lap and his pristine white silk tie. "What the hell are you doing, you stupid cow?" Leo roared, leaping up from his chair, frantically brushing at the ruin of his expensive suit. Juliet stepped back, her face a mask of perfect customer service serenity. "My deepest apology, Mr. Lombardi," Juliet said, her voice dripping with a sweetness that was sharper than any knife. "It seems my depth perception is off tonight. I so often overestimate exactly how much a man like you can handle." A few of Enzo's men coughed to hide their sudden, barking laughter. The insult was brilliant. It was subtle enough to be passed off as an accident by a clumsy maid, but sharp enough to completely emasculate Leo in front of his own crew. Leo's face turned purple with rage. He raised his hand, fully intending to strike her. "Leo!" Enzo's voice was quiet, but it cracked through the room like a whip. Enzo was on his feet, his hand resting casually on the table, but every muscle in his body was coiled for violence. "If you so much as breathe too heavily in her direction, your family will be planning a closed-casket funeral tomorrow. Sit down." Leo looked at Enzo, saw the absolute promise of death in the younger man's eyes, and slowly, humiliatingly, lowered his hand. "Miss Jenkins," Enzo said, not breaking eye contact with Leo, "please bring Mr. Lombardi a towel. It seems he's made a mess." "Right away, sir," Juliet replied. She gave Enzo a brief, almost imperceptible nod of gratitude and turned to leave the room. The rest of the dinner passed in tense, subdued silence. Leo Lombardi left early, his pride in tatters. Later that night, the house was quiet once more. Enzo was in his study, pouring himself a drink. Replaying the moment, Juliet had verbally castrated his enemy. He felt a sudden, fierce possessiveness grip his chest. He wanted to protect her. I wanted to know everything about her. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called out. Juliet entered, holding a silver tray. but there was no tea or coffee on it. She walked over to his desk and set the tray down. Sitting in the center of the polished silver was a tiny, matte black electronic device, no bigger than a fingernail. Enzo stared at it, his blood running cold. A listening device. A bug. "I found it stuck beneath the lip of the dining table," Juliet said quietly, her professional demeanor replaced by a grave seriousness. "On the underside, exactly where Gregory was sitting during the pre-dinner setup. He was the only one in the room before the guests arrived." Enzo looked from the bug to Juliet. His trusted estate manager. A mole. The Lombardis had a rat inside his house, and they would have heard everything. All his private conversations, his strategies, if not for the fat, quiet maid who noticed everything and feared nothing. "Why bring this to me?" Enzo asked, his voice low. "Why not just leave it, or sell the information?" Juliet looked at him, her dark eyes steady. "Because, Mr. Costa, you pay me to clean your house, and it seems you have a rat infestation." Enzo stared at her, the realization hitting him like a freight train. Juliet Jenkins wasn't just surviving in his world. She was mastering it. And God help him, he was falling for her. The removal of Gregory from the Costa estate was swift, silent, and permanent. Juliet did not ask where the estate manager went, nor did she inquire about the muffled pleading she heard from the soundproofed basement before Enzo's right-hand man, Dominic, drove a black SUV off the property at 3 in the morning. She simply bleached the basement floor the next day and ordered a new rug for the foyer. Enzo, however, could not simply move on. Juliet's discovery of the listening device had saved his empire from a catastrophic federal raid and a coordinated hit by the Lombardi family. She had proven her loyalty, her intelligence, and her nerve. But Enzo Costa was a man who hated mysteries, and Juliet Jenkins was the greatest mystery he had ever encountered. He summoned Dominic to his study the following evening. "I want everything on her," Enzo ordered, pouring 2 glasses of Macallan 25. "Not just the background check we ran when she was hired. I want her bank statements, her family history, her internet search history. I want to know why a woman with nerves of steel and the intellect of a wartime consigliere is scrubbing my floors for an hourly wage." It took Dominic less than 48 hours to breach Juliet's intensely guarded privacy. When Dominic laid the manila folder on the mahogany desk, his usually stoic face was grim. "It's her brother, boss. Toby Jenkins. He's 22. He's been admitted to Mount Sinai Hospital in Manhattan for the last 3 months. Acute liver failure." Enzo frowned, opening the file. He flipped through stark medical records and escalating financial notices. "Is he on the transplant list?" "I was," Dominic corrected gently. "But under Dr. Harrison Miller's care, the out-of-pocket costs for the required preoperative treatments reached over $340,000. Her insurance capped out. She took this job because of the signing bonus, but it barely covered the interest on her medical loans. They were going to bump Toby down the UNOS list tomorrow due to lack of financial viability for the post-op care." Enzo stared at the numbers. To a man who spent $50,000 on a single hand-tailored suit, the sum was trivial. But to a woman scrubbing floors, it was a mountain that was crushing her alive. Suddenly, Juliet's absolute lack of fear made terrifying sense. She wasn't brave because she didn't understand the danger of the Mafia. She was brave because the monster of poverty and the imminent death of her only brother was vastly more terrifying than any gun Enzo could point at her. "Fix it," Enzo said, his voice a low, gravelly command. Dominic blinked. "Boss? You heard me. Call the board at Mount Sinai. I want the entire balance paid in full through our offshore shell accounts. I want Toby Jenkins moved to the VIP wing on the top floor. I want Dr. Miller to personally guarantee he is bumped to the top of that list. If the hospital administrators give you any bureaucratic pushback, remind them who funds their new pediatric wing." "Done?" Dominic nodded, turning to leave. "And Dominic?" Enzo called out, his eyes darkening with a fierce, protective possessiveness he had never felt before. "If anyone ever threatens that boy's spot on the list again, break their legs." 2 days later, Juliet was in the kitchen, aggressively kneading a large mound of dough. It was her coping mechanism. Her phone had been ringing incessantly all morning, and she had ignored it, assuming it was the hospital's billing department, calling to deliver the final, crushing blow. When it rang again, she wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron, snatched it off the counter, and barked, "I told you, I am wiring the next installment on Friday. Miss Jenkins." The voice on the other end was breathless and overly polite. "This is Rebecca from Mount Sinai Administration. I'm not calling about a bill. I'm calling to inform you that Toby has been moved to the East Tower Executive Suite." Juliet froze. The East Tower was for foreign dignitaries and billionaires. "What? Why? I didn't authorize a transfer. We can't afford." "Miss Jenkins, your balance is 0, Rebecca interrupted, her tone bordering on reverent. "An anonymous benefactor cleared the entire debt this morning. Furthermore, a liver became available, and due to the newly updated financial viability profile, Toby is in surgery right now with Dr. Miller. He's getting the transplant." The phone slipped from Juliet's fingers, clattering against the marble countertop. For the first time since she had walked through the iron gates of the Costa estate, her knees buckled. She sank down onto the heavy wooden stool, her large chest heaving, the air suddenly completely sucked from her lungs. A sob, violent and sudden, tore from her throat. It took her exactly 3 minutes to piece it together. The absolute secrecy, the limitless funds, the sudden bending of bureaucratic rules. There was only one man with the power, the money, and the ruthless disregard for waiting lines to pull this off. She stood up. She didn't bother to wipe the flour from her cheek or smooth her apron. She marched out of the kitchen, her heavy, purposeful footsteps echoing down the grand hallway, straight toward the lion's den. She didn't knock. She shoved the heavy oak doors of Enzo's study open with enough force to make them bounce off the wall stops. Enzo looked up from his ledger. He took one look at her flushed face, the tears shining in her dark eyes, and the flour dusting her generous curves, and his heart slammed against his ribs. "You," Juliet breathed, pointing a shaking, dough-covered finger at him. "What did you do?" Enzo slowly closed his ledger. He leaned back in his leather chair, trying to maintain his composed facade, but the raw emotion rolling off her was intoxicating. "I simply expedited a medical process, Miss Jenkins. The healthcare system is notoriously inefficient." $340,000, Juliet practically yelled, stepping into his space. She planted her hands on his desk, leaning over him. The neckline of her uniform dipped, and Enzo's eyes involuntarily dropped to the soft, heavy swell of her cleavage before snapping back to her furious gaze. "You bought my brother's life. Why?" "I didn't ask for your charity. I don't owe you." "You owe me nothing," Enzo roared back, suddenly surging to his feet. He was inches from her now. You think this is about leverage? You think I'm holding a marker over your head? Then why? She demanded, a stray tear finally escaping and cutting a track through the flower on her cheek. Enzo reached out. He didn't think. He just moved. His large, scarred hands cupped her face. His thumbs gently brushed the tear away, smudging the flower into her warm skin. Juliet gasped at the sudden, burning contact, her eyes widening. Because, Enzo said, his voice dropping to a rough, desperate whisper, I watched you stare down the barrel of my gun without blinking. But you look like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders every single day. Because you saved my life and my Emma from a bug under a dining table and asked for nothing in return. Because I can't sleep at night without thinking about the way you hum in the kitchen. Juliet's breath hitched. She stared into the eyes of the most dangerous man in New York and saw nothing but a terrifying, absolute devotion. I am a maid, Enzo, she whispered, using his first name for the first time. I am fat. I am tired. I am not one of your glamorous Mafia princesses. Good, Enzo growled, stepping closer, his hands sliding down her jaw to rest on her broad, strong shoulders. He pulled her against his solid chest, marveling at the soft, perfect weight of her against him. I don't want a princess. I need a queen who isn't afraid of the blood. Let me take care of you, Juliet. Let me take care of your family. For a long moment, the study was dead silent, save for the ragged sound of their combined breathing. Juliet looked at him, feeling the solid, immovable strength of him. She had fought the world alone for so long. Slowly, she let her forehead rest against his chest. It was a surrender, not of weakness, but of exhaustion. Enzo wrapped his arms around her thick waist, burying his face in her hair, closing his eyes as a profound sense of peace finally settled over his chaotic life. The fragile peace lasted exactly 1 week. Toby's surgery had been a complete success. I was recovering rapidly in the VIP wing of Mount Sinai, surrounded by round-the-clock private security that Enzo had quietly arranged. Juliet felt as though a 1,000-pound weight had been lifted from her chest. Her relationship with Enzo remained a private, unspoken thing within the walls of the estate. During the day, she was still the efficient, unflappable head maid. But at night, behind the closed doors of his study, she was his confidant, his anchor, and the only woman who dared to tell the boss of the Costa family when he was acting like a fool. The physical tension between them was a smoldering fire, building with every stolen glance and lingering touch, waiting for a catalyst to ignite. That catalyst arrived on a rainy Tuesday evening. Enzo had insisted Juliet accompany him to Manhattan. He claimed he needed her impeccable taste to select a gift for a business associate. But Juliet knew he simply wanted her out of the house, away from her endless chores. They were riding at the back of his armored Mercedes Maybach, the rain streaking the tinted windows, blurring the neon lights of Times Square. Enzo was wearing a bespoke charcoal suit, and Juliet wore a simple, elegant navy wrap dress she had bought from a plus-size boutique years ago. It hugged her curves perfectly, and she hadn't missed the way Enzo's eyes darkened when she walked down the stairs that evening. We are stopping at Le Bernardin, Enzo announced smoothly, checking his platinum Patek Philippe watch. I've reserved the private dining room. Juliet raised an eyebrow. Mr. Costa, I am your maid. People will talk. Let them, Enzo replied, a dangerous smirk playing on his lips. He reached across the leather seat and took her hand, weaving his fingers through hers. If anyone has a problem with the woman I choose to dine with, I will personally ensure they never chew solid food again. Juliet sighed, squeezing his hand. You are so dramatic. The Maybach turned down a narrow, shadowed side street, approaching the underground parking garage of the restaurant. Dominic, driving the car, slowed down to scan his keycard at the security gate. That was when the world exploded. A black tactical van rammed through the exit barrier of the garage, slamming directly into the front of the Maybach. The sound of crunching metal and shattered glass was deafening. Juliet was thrown forward, the seatbelt biting violently into her collarbone. Get down, Enzo. Before Juliet could fully process the collision, the deafening crack, crack, crack of automatic gunfire echoed through the concrete garage. Sparks flew as bullets rained against the armored glass of the Maybach, spiderwebbing the reinforced windows. It was Leo Lombardi's men. They had found the perfect choke point. Dominic! Status! Enzo barked, drawing his Sig Sauer from his shoulder holster, his body instinctively curving over Juliet's, shielding her entirely with his bulk. Engine block is cracked, boss. We're pinned, Dominic yelled from the front seat, drawing his own weapon. He kicked his door open and fired 3 rapid shots into the smoke, dropping one of the masked gunmen advancing on the car. We can't stay in the car. The armor won't hold up to armor-piercing rounds, Enzo yelled over the din. He looked down at Juliet, who was trapped beneath his chest. He expected panic. He expected hysterics. Instead, Juliet was staring past his shoulder out the window, her eyes darting around the chaotic scene. She wasn't screaming. She was calculating. Enzo, Juliet said, her voice eerily calm, despite the gunfire tearing the air apart. There's a service elevator, 10 yards to the right. It leads straight up to the restaurant kitchens. Enzo looked. She was right. A heavy steel door marked staff only stood slightly ajar in the concrete wall. On my mark, we move, Enzo ordered, his eyes locked on hers. You run, Juliet. You do not stop. I am not leaving you, she stated flatly. You are going to do exactly as I say, he roared, a bullet embedding itself in the door frame mere inches from his head. Enzo kicked his door open. Now! He grabbed her hand and hauled her out of the vehicle. They burst into the damp, smoky air of the garage. Enzo fired a suppressing barrage toward the tactical van, dropping a second gunman. They sprinted toward the steel door. Juliet ran, her heavy footsteps slapping against the wet concrete. She wasn't built for sprinting, but adrenaline pushed her forward. They were 5 yards away when a gunman stepped out from behind a concrete pillar, raising a shotgun directly at Juliet. Enzo didn't hesitate. He threw himself in front of her. The shotgun roared. Enzo grunted, a violent jerk twisting his body as the buckshot grazed his side, tearing through his suit jacket and grazing his ribs. He fell, taking the gunman down with 2 precise shots to the chest as he hit the ground. Enzo! Juliet screamed, her calm finally shattering. She dropped to her knees beside him on the dirty concrete. Blood was blooming rapidly on his white shirt. Get to the door, Enzo wheezed, trying to push her away, his face pale. Go! Shut up, Juliet snapped, her practical nature violently reasserting itself. She grabbed him by the lapels of his ruined suit and, fueled by pure, terrifying adrenaline, hauled his 220-pound frame up. She shoved him through the heavy steel door of the service entrance, throwing her own substantial weight against the metal to slam it shut just as a spray of bullets pinged against the outside. She slammed the heavy deadbolt into place. They were in a dark, narrow concrete stairwell. Enzo slid down the wall, clutching his bleeding side, his breathing ragged. Juliet didn't panic. She fell to her knees beside him, immediately ripping open his ruined shirt. The wound was ugly, bleeding heavily, but it wasn't a direct hit. It was a deep graze. "You're a stubborn, stupid man," Juliet scolded, her voice trembling as she tore a large strip of fabric from the hem of her own dress. She balled it up and pressed it violently against the wound. Enzo hissed in pain, his head falling back against the concrete. But as he looked at her, kneeling in the dirt, her dress torn, her hands covered in his blood, fiercely trying to save him, he smiled. It was a bloody, feral smile. "You ruined your dress," he gasped. Juliet let out a wet, choked laugh, pressing her full weight onto the makeshift bandage to stem the bleeding. "Don't worry, Mr. Costa. Tomorrow is payday. You're buying me a new one." Enzo reached up with a blood-stained hand, grabbing the back of her neck, pulling her down. He didn't care about the pain, the blood, or the fact that they were being hunted. He kissed her. It was desperate, hard, and tasting of copper and rain. Juliet froze for a fraction of a second before melting against him, her soft lips moving hungrily against his, her large body shielding his injured one in the dark stairwell. In that violent, terrifying moment, the Maid and the Mafia boss ceased to exist. There was only a man bleeding for the woman he loved, and a woman fiercely holding him together. The kiss broke only when a heavy thud echoed against the steel door behind them. Leo Lombardi's men were trying to breach the stairwell. "We need to move," Juliet gasped, her lips swollen, her hands still slick with Enzo's blood. The romantic interlude vanished, instantly replaced by the terrifying reality of their situation. Enzo nodded, his face pale and covered in a sheen of cold sweat. "Help me up." Juliet positioned herself under his left shoulder, wrapping her thick, sturdy arm around his waist. She braced her legs that had carried her through double shifts and miles of hospital corridors, and hauled him upward. Enzo bit back a groan as they began the grueling ascent. The stairwell was narrow, smelling of bleach and old concrete, a stark contrast to the violence erupting below. Every step was a battle. Enzo was heavy, a wall of pure muscle. But Juliet's soft, generous frame held a deceptive, grounding strength. She acted as his crutch, murmuring fierce, continuous words of encouragement that sounded suspiciously like threats. "If you die on me, Enzo Costa, I will bring you back, just to kill you myself," she panted, her calves burning as they reached the third landing. "I have not polished your mahogany for a month, just to watch you bleed out in a service stairwell." A weak, breathless chuckle rumbled in Enzo's chest. "You are a terrifying woman, Juliet." They finally reached the top door, which opened into the sprawling, chaotic industrial kitchen of Le Bernardin. The staff had already fled, alerted by the gunfire echoing from the parking garage. Pots were left boiling on industrial ranges, and half-plated lobsters sat abandoned on stainless steel counters. Juliet kicked the door shut behind them and dragged Enzo toward a massive walk-in refrigerator, hoping the thick insulated steel would provide cover. Just as they reached the metal counter, the stairwell door they had just exited burst open. A hitman stepped into the kitchen, his tactical rifle raised, sweeping the room. He wore a black balaclava, but his eyes locked onto the trail of blood smudged across the pristine white floor tiles. Enzo tried to raise his Sig Sauer, but his arm was trembling violently from blood loss. He fired a shot, but it went wide, shattering a row of wine glasses above the prep station. The hitman smirked, turning the barrel of his rifle directly toward Enzo's chest. Juliet did not think. She reacted with the same swift, brutal efficiency she used to tackle a stubborn wine stain. She lunged to her right, grabbing the handle of a massive cast-iron skillet resting on a blazing industrial burner. It was filled with smoking, searing hot duck fat. With a guttural yell that tore from her throat, Juliet swung her wide hips, using her entire body weight for momentum, and hurled the boiling oil directly at the hitman's face. The man released a blood-curdling scream as the searing liquid hit him. He dropped his rifle, clawing frantically at his face, blindly stumbling backward. Juliet didn't stop. She closed the distance in 3 heavy strides, raised the 50-pound cast-iron skillet high above her head, and brought it down across the hitman's skull with a sickening crack. The man crumpled to the floor, completely unconscious. Juliet stood over him, her chest heaving, the torn, blood-stained navy-wrap dress clinging to her ample curves. She looked like an avenging Valkyrie, forged in the fires of a Michelin star kitchen. She turned back to look at Enzo. He had slipped down against the counter, clutching his side. He was staring at her, completely, utterly mesmerized. "Duck fat," Juliet breathed, her hands shaking as the adrenaline began to crash. A nightmare to clean off stainless steel. Before Enzo could respond, the front doors of the kitchen swung open. Juliet snatched up the dropped tactical rifle, struggling to lift it, but ready to fight to the death. "Hold your fire! It's me!" Dominic burst into the room, flanked by 4 heavily armed Costa enforcers. They were covered in but their eyes were wild with panic until they spotted their boss. "Perimeter is secure. The NYPD is 2 minutes out on our payroll, but we need to disappear," Dominic barked, rushing to Enzo's side. He took one look at the unconscious hitman with a skillet indent on his skull, and then looked at Juliet. A deep, profound respect dawned in the enforcer's eyes. "Get him to Dr. Pendleton," Juliet commanded, dropping the heavy rifle and kneeling beside Enzo again. "Now, Dominic." "I'm not leaving without you," Enzo wheezed, his fingers weakly grasping Juliet's wrist. "I'm right here," Juliet said softly, her warm hand covering his cold one. "I'm not going anywhere." It took 3 weeks for the dust to settle and the blood to wash away. In that time, the underworld of New York experienced a seismic shift. Enzo Costa survived his injury, thanks to the discreet surgical skills of Dr. Arthur Pendleton. But while Enzo recovered in his heavily guarded bedroom, a shadow war was waged. Dominic and the Costa enforcers systematically dismantled the Lombardi family. Leo Lombardi was found floating in the East River, and his lieutenants quickly surrendered their territories to the Costa Empire. But the most shocking shift was not territorial. It was domestic. Juliet Jenkins never put on a maid's apron again. She had moved out of the staff quarters and into the sprawling master suite. Her brother, Toby, was recovering beautifully, living in a luxury condo Enzo had purchased out of pocket, completely debt-free. The staff of the estate quickly learned to adapt. Juliet was no longer the woman who scrubbed the floors. She was the woman who commanded the man who owned the city. Yet she remained uniquely herself. She still inspected the dusting in the library and she still baked fresh bread in the kitchen when she was stressed, though now she did it wearing silk robes instead of a uniform. Her final test, her true coronation, came during a celebratory dinner held in the grand dining room of the estate. Enzo, though still moving with a slight stiffness in his side, sat at the head of the table. He looked dangerous, regal, and completely at ease. To his right sat Juliet. She wore a custom-made emerald green velvet gown that draped magnificently over her full figure. Her hair was styled elegantly, and a blinding diamond necklace rested against her collarbone. She looked every inch a queen. The table was filled with Enzo's top lieutenants and capos. Most of them had heard the whispers of how the boss's life was saved by a skillet-wielding maid, and they treated her with a cautious, fearful reverence. All except Vincent Rossi. Vincent was a bitter, old-school capo from the Brooklyn faction. He had always resented Enzo's modern approach to business, and he clearly despised seeing a soft, heavy-set woman sitting at the right hand of power. Throughout the dinner, Vincent made thinly veiled, passive-aggressive remarks about tradition and the softening of the Costa family. Enzo's eyes grew darker with every slight, his hand inching toward the steak knife resting by his plate. But Juliet placed her warm, soft hand over Enzo's, silently telling him to stand down. When dessert was served, Vincent leaned back in his chair, swirling his cognac, a nasty smirk on his face. "It's a lovely meal, Miss Jenkins," Vincent drawled, emphasizing her last name. "It's good to see you haven't forgotten your roots, though I have to admit, it's strange seeing the help sitting at the table instead of clearing it." The dining room fell completely silent. The temperature plummeted. Dominic, sitting across the table, closed his eyes, silently praying for Vincent's soul. Juliet did not flinch. She picked up her linen napkin, elegantly dabbed her lips, and then set it down. She turned her large, dark eyes onto Vincent. "My roots are precisely what make me valuable, Vincent," Juliet said, her voice smooth and rich, carrying effortlessly through the quiet room. "When you clean a house, you see all the dirt that people try to sweep under the rugs." She leaned forward, resting her plump forearms on the mahogany table. "For instance, I noticed some very interesting dirt while tidying up the offshore ledgers last month. You know, the ones Mr. Costa keeps in the locked drawer of his desk, the drawer you assumed a maid wouldn't know how to pick." Vincent's smug smile faltered. A bead of sweat broke out on his forehead. "I noticed a rather glaring discrepancy in the shipping manifests coming out of the Red Hook ports," Juliet continued, her tone conversational, yet laced with lethal venom. "About $400,000 worth of untaxed cargo that somehow never made it into the family's central account. Strangely, a shell corporation registered in the Caymans under your wife's maiden name saw a deposit of the exact same amount 3 days later." Vincent went deathly pale. He looked at Enzo, who was watching Juliet with an expression of pure, unadulterated worship. "Now," Juliet said, leaning back in her chair and picking up her wine glass, "a maid might just sweep that dirt away. But I am not a maid anymore, Vincent. I am the woman who ensures this house is clean, and I absolutely despise a rat." Vincent pushed his chair back, his hands shaking as he stood up. "Enzo, boss, I swear it's a misunderstanding." "You don't address me," Enzo interrupted, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "You address my queen, and since you disrespected her at my table, you will leave your territories to Dominic. You will surrender the Cayman account by midnight, and you will retire to Florida. If I see your face in New York again, Juliet won't have to clean up the mess, I'll bury you beneath the rose garden myself." Vincent swallowed hard, completely broken. He nodded once, gave a terrified bow to Juliet, and hurried out of the dining room. The rest of the capos sat in stunned, terrified silence. Juliet took a sip of her wine, then turned to Dominic. "Dominic, please ensure the Red Hook ledgers are audited by Friday. I want every penny accounted for." "Yes, ma'am," Dominic said, a genuine smile breaking through his stoic face. Later that night, the house was quiet. Juliet was standing by the massive window in the master bedroom, looking out over the moonlit rose garden. She had traded the emerald gown for a soft cotton nightdress, her thick, gorgeous curves silhouetted by the moonlight. Enzo came up behind her, wrapping his strong arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He pressed a soft kiss to her bare shoulder. "You were magnificent tonight," Enzo murmured against her skin. "Terrifying, but magnificent." "I told you," Juliet said softly, leaning into his solid warmth. "I know how to clean up a mess." Enzo reached into his pocket. He took her left hand, gently lifting it in the moonlight. He slid a massive, flawless, emerald-cut diamond ring onto her ring finger. It was heavy, undeniable, and permanent. "Then clean up the rest of my life, Juliet," Enzo whispered fiercely, turning her around so he could look deeply into her brown eyes. "Marry me. Rule with me. Let me worship the ground you walk on." Juliet looked at the ring, then up at the dangerous, beautiful man who had bought her brother's life and given her the world. She smiled, a bright, warm smile that completely chased away the shadows of the Mafia underworld. "All right, Mr. Costa," Juliet whispered, pulling his face down for a kiss. "But I'm still doing the cooking on Sundays." What starts as a desperate bid for survival transforms into a masterclass in power and defiance. Juliet Jenkins proved that true strength doesn't come from a size tag or a weapon, but from an unbreakable spirit and a sharp mind. She walked into the lion's den as a maid, and walked out as the undeniable queen of the underworld, proving that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone underestimates. Did Juliet's absolute boss moves leave you speechless? Hit that like button, share this story with someone who loves a fierce, unstoppable heroine, and subscribe to the channel for more dramatic, heart-pounding romances where the underdogs rule the empire